Before we start, if you could please introduce yourselves, talk a little bit about what you do and what you don't.
Hold this,
Mike.
Is this working?
Yeah.
Yeah, great. Hey, Rob Ricca, VP of Corporate Development at Scopely. I've been there for about a year. Before that, I was at Glue Mobile for 4 years, doing business development and corporate development. So really focused on mergers and acquisitions and investments and other game developers.
I'm Matt Hooper. I'm managing partner of IME Law. We represent game developers and, I guess, immersive media developers. Our clients have done about $16 billion in global sales, 7 Guinness World Records for sales. So we do a lot of deal flow in that space and hopefully can help you all to see some red flags before they arise.
My name is Nick Thomas. I'm the VP of Commercial Partnerships at Hatch. Hatch is a mobile game streaming platform. We're a subsidiary of Rovio, and we're launching the world's first 5G gaming streaming service. So it's a really exciting time, and glad to be here.
Jim Ying, I'm with CVCapital. We're an investment bank headquartered in Shanghai. We focus on working with companies that are looking to raise late-stage capital and M&A, particularly from Asia.
Daniel Todd, CEO of Influence Mobile. We operate 200 sports rewards apps, primarily focused around engaging female sports fans and getting them to play games like Scopely and Jam City and a lot of other games by associating what they already love, sports, and building behaviors in those games.
So as you can see, we have a very diverse panel, so I hope that we can actually cover a lot of ground here. We're going to be talking about future opportunities for devs. And my first question, well, I'm not actually going to ask you directly personally. Feel free to jump in every question you feel that you have something to add in. But I would like to ask, with the mobile market being so saturated at the moment and a lot of indie developers having difficulty reaching the users the way they were supposed to do, with the legislation being also challenging and in the integration all the time, do you believe there are creative solutions that the developers can explore in the market? I started hard.
I mean, I guess I can start, but leave it to the lawyer and the marketing expert over there to really dig in and provide the big answers. But yeah, I mean, I think we're seeing it all the time that developers are finding new and creative ways to break through the market, and I think a lot of it is about being very purposeful and finding that niche. I mean, a developer like Playrix, 5 years ago, I think we were sitting at Glue saying, oh wow, King's got this Candy Crush, like no one's going to be able to break in there on match 3. And then Playrix comes out and innovates and has this whole Invest Express meta and something totally new and different that the players loved, and they're able to kind of break through. I think also through kind of we're seeing like with influencer marketing or a company like Seriously buying radio advertisement and doing new innovative things that allowed them to kind of break through and get out of this kind of performance marketing cycle that we're seeing. But yeah, definitely let Daniel and some of these experts talk more about it.
I mean, what we've been seeing is better integration between app developers and the publishers. It used to be that you just gave money to Google and hoped that the people that played your game would play. But I think what we've seen with a lot of rewarded activities, whether it's rewarded video, is just better integration start to lead to better returns for app developers. And so the more creative that they can be and the more willing they are to test, they ultimately get higher returns.
And from a legislation perspective, it seems like every time a great new invention or new way of monetization comes about, immediately governments want to legislate to kind of dampen it. And so obviously from a privacy perspective, you've seen things come up like GDPR, which is creating issues internationally. Just on May 8th or May 9th, a Republican from West Virginia, I think is a senator, or no, it was a House, someone in Congress, brought out a bill trying to regulate microtransactions and loot boxes and that kind of thing. Now, they're trying to target it more towards children, but they're using an analogous law called COPA that they're kind of trying to potentially tie it to, but then they're now broadening upon it. So we'll see what happens. But yeah, the legislation issues, it's just good to get out ahead of them, be aware of them. And then, you know, the ESA, I know, is doing a lot of work to try to counteract some of those things.
Good. Well, I think that we always had legislation problems. I think that the biggest problem is that the game developers were just focused in developing while the publishers were focused on the market, and nowadays there is a better communication between them. Both developers and publishers need to be aware of the changes in the market all the time. So very good. So what are the new platforms developers should be researching and developing?
I think a really interesting one is, if anything, things have swung too far to the mobile side of things. So console PC gaming used to be big. If you look at the absolute numbers, it still is a growing market, but things have swung so much towards mobile because people see the growth of that market. They see what the top grossing games are making. But there's always been that consumer base that does want to play the more hardcore, more visually intensive games. There's still millions of consoles out there. And then with the announcement of Google Stadia, with Amazon getting into gaming more seriously, Microsoft, Sony, they have their streaming platforms. I think that's an area that is less tapped right now. And for companies that are looking to start up and jump into an area, I think there's more upside there.
Yeah, I would just add to that. It's actually what Hatch is really focused on as well, is bringing new distribution channels and a new revenue opportunity for developers. I agree with Jim. I think there's been so much focus on the kind of free-to-play mobile space that the sort of traditional PC kind of premium development angle has been that has waned. A lot of these platforms are starting to merge those two worlds. So what Hatch is doing as an example is it's a mobile-first platform, but we're focused on premium content. And that content doesn't actually have to be mobile. It can be PC or Switch type of games that are then, sort of adapted for touch input and then distributed through a mobile-first channel. So you can monetize more broadly, and you don't have to think in these narrow sort of, PC versus free-to-play mobile. There's now a middle ground that's emerged, which I think is a really greenfield opportunity.
Yeah, I mean, I think things are moving more cross-platform, and I think, mobile probably will continue to grow and be the majority of revenue in interactive entertainment. But I do think there's a lot of room for mobile games to cross over to PC and console and vice versa. Obviously, we're seeing it with things like Fortnite. But I think given free-to-play is the kind of dominant monetization model out there, and it's just making so much more money per customer than kind of other forms of monetization, I think we are going to see the free-to-play kind of move in more on the PC and console side, and continue to maybe grow revenues more on those platforms.
And on the developers that want to work with publishers, how should this the typical deal between publisher and developer, how should it look like, and what should developers be looking for if they want to work with publishers?
Okay. I mean, one of the biggest issues is who owns the IP, right? That's a big question. If you wind up creating a franchise-based game or any game that has legs to it, who owns the IP? Who's responsible for live ops to the extent that there's live ops going on? Whose cost is that at? And subsequent productions, what rights are there with respect to subsequent productions, prequels, sequels, ports to the extent that exists if we're dealing with console stuff. I mean, there's a number of things. The economics, what's the royalty structure look like? We're seeing more and more now developers pushing for where publishers have rights with respect to release date and kind of controls in that regard. Developers pushing to have some sort of a timeline where if a game isn't released after Gold Master delivery for some period of time, that there's some sort of a kicker that they receive automatically. So it just depends, I guess, in part on leverage. But there are a number of deal terms, definitions. Talk about the devil's in the details. You get into definitions of revenue and costs and expenses. That's where you really get into it, right? Is it a third-party expense? Is it reasonable? Is it out of pocket? Because otherwise, next thing you know, your game could do $50 million, and guess what? The publisher had $60 million in expenses. So it just depends on, there's just a number of factors like that.
The interesting part is it might be great to work with a publisher, it might be your worst mistake depending on how you do the deal, right?
That's right, yeah.
My take on that is that publishers have gotten a bit lazy and they're very used to just doing things in a very comfortable, single, sort of focused manner. And I'd like to see publishers being more proactive around some of these new business opportunities for their clients, who are the developers that they represent. Going out and looking at something like Apple Arcade and thinking, well, what does this mean for my client? How could we do something that's special, meaningful for this direct relationship, rather than just sort of applying a formula to every single product that comes through the door? I don't think that works for everyone, so they need to be more customized for each of their clients.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to see how developer-publisher relationships have changed even over the last couple of years. So I started in gaming at Xbox, and there was a very traditional developer-publisher relationship where the developer would build the game, they would literally hand off the code to the publisher, and then the publisher would run with it, and they would have the retailer relationships, they would have the ability to make the boxes and the DVDs, whereas now it's much more blended, and if anything, the developer has to stay engaged long-term along with the publisher, and it is very hard to maintain and align interests because outside of funding, increasingly there's a lot of things that developers can just do themselves, especially on the PC, mobile side of things.
I think I'd add to Jim's point. I mean, the live ops angle, it's very different than what we've seen in the past, and you need to build these relationships for that long term and have partners that want to be in this. I think Scopely, one of their first successful games was mini golf matchup, and I think the publisher made a bunch of money on launch, and after the first couple of months was like, all right, great, all right, I'm moving on now. And Scopely quickly learned the lesson, and the relationship with our development partners has evolved over time, and we don't even think of ourselves as a publisher anymore. We're more of a co-development shop where we've got a bunch of people on the Scopely side working on the game alongside our development partner, and have arrangements where we're looking at the long term, the benefit for both parties. So it's a different mindset these days.
So one of the questions you asked is, how do you identify the good publishers? I would say definitely look at the publisher's track record, right? So there are companies out there like Scopely who have worked successfully with external developers, and their games have been successful, and the games have been live for many, many years. Whereas there are publishers out there who are saying that they're publishing games, but then you ask them what games have they actually successfully published to the top grossing charts. And unless really they can call those out, that would be pretty suspect.
From the investment point of view, what are the issues that the developers should keep in mind to attract the right investment and also to avoid pitfalls when working with investors?
I think
that was for you, Jim.
One thing to keep in mind is, from the investor or the publisher standpoint, what is it that they want to get out of it, right? So most VCs, when they're investing in developers, they want that 10 times, 20 times, 100 times exit, right? So they're not looking for a developer that's coming in and saying, all right, we're going to build a low-risk platform that's going to generate some cash flow. They want the home run, right? Because within their investments, within their portfolio, they're making a bunch of bets to hedge their own risk. Right, but they want each individual bet to be a grand slam. And so if your business doesn't have the opportunity to be a grand slam, and that's not how you're pitching it, chances are you're not going to get investment from that source.
And then also from a due diligence perspective, I've seen several deals fall apart because developers just didn't do things that they wouldn't think to do, because they all got together as friends and made a game, and the game was great, and then they made another one, right? But they never got an employment agreement in place, right? Or they never got a confidential information and invention assignment agreement in place. Like some of the basic fundamentals that allow the company to actually own the IP that is the backbone of its library, or the backbone of, to the extent that they have a patent or something along those lines, any of that ownership, they just don't do it. So I'd say another thing to do is don't be penny wise, pound foolish. Go out and get somebody up front to at least make sure you have the basic agreements in place. So
I would also say be very thoughtful about the business plan. I think I see a lot of developers that are early stage and maybe are kind of all over the place or don't have like a clear plan in place. And I think, if you can show that you've been very thoughtful and thought it through, and can clearly articulate what you're trying to do with your company, it makes a huge difference, and kind of stick to what you're passionate about, and find that niche, find that area where you're saying, this is how I'm going to differentiate, and make it clear to the investor how you're going to achieve that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I have seen companies that they just want the money, so they don't understand what does it mean in having an investor in your board of directors, or sell your IP for an investor without knowing what's going to happen afterwards. They just want the money to do the next game without it. So that's all of the very good advice. So we want to jump for platforms. What are the platforms that are markets and platforms that we believe do you believe that are gonna be the big things for future? Where should developers be looking for that they are not doing now?
Well, I'll start that, but I'm actually mostly interested in what the others think, because I'm drinking the Kool-Aid on this topic. I really think the free-to-play world is tired. I mean, I know there's still a lot of opportunity there. Free-to-play will always exist, and I'm sure be a very meaningful revenue stream for those who know how to tap into it the right way. I think there's this neglected new paradigm that's coming to market with streaming through subscription, different distribution channels, this kind of cross distribution around PC to mobile and vice versa. To me, that seems wide open. And for the first time, the technology's there, and the content tools like Unity that make it so easy to distribute or compile for different formats. It seems like everything is finally aligning around this idea of these new platform opportunities. But it's also very new. And so, for someone like Jim, I'm personally interested in how they see that opportunity with the risk versus the obvious sort of, trend of where everything is heading right now.
I think to look on something that we mentioned before, like one is, where do we think the majority of the future revenue will come from? And a lot of it is definitely on mobile. It is a growing market. I think one way to think about it from a developer standpoint, and also how investors might be looking at it, is who are already the leaders in that space? How likely are they to continue succeeding? And if you're starting a new studio or a new team or a new product, how likely are you to catch up to them? Or what is your competitive advantage versus the folks who are already there? Right, so if you look at something like mobile gaming, where there's 5, 10, 15 dominant players globally, where they're sinking millions into development, millions into marketing, and they have an experienced team, what are the chances that you're going to be able to catch up to those folks? Right? Whereas there are other platforms out there, Stadia, are ones where people have swung too far away from, console, PC, where it is, if you do have the right experience. So there's a lot of folks who worked on console games, but then they swung over to the mobile side of things. But it is very hard to build one of those teams from scratch and to build the complexity of that type of game. I think there's a lot of opportunity there. And with the streaming platforms out there, all those streaming platforms, the reason why you need to stream is because the game is going to be technically challenging, difficult to play on a mobile device. And so those types of games, I think there's going to be opportunity there. And from the free-to-play perspective, I'm bullish on long-term free-to-play. I think there are always going to be segments of people who don't want to play those types of games. But I think if you look at the top-grossing charts, either PC or mobile, at this point it's proven that that's where a lot of the upside is. But historically, it's been the mobile side of things where that's really, really picked up. There are still some developers in some markets that are a little reluctant on PC. So a lot of the console players, they've had walled gardens around their audience bases, and they're only now just starting to really accept free-to-play. But all of those are essentially whales. Like anyone who can put out $400, $500, $600 for a console, they're going to be willing to spend. It's just a matter of, are they comfortable yet with free-to-play? But I think everyone will get there eventually.
Yeah, I mean, just to kind of further on Jim's points, like I think free-to-play, I think we're still early stages. I mean, I think this is just a growing, I think more and more users are converting on the free-to-play. Like you can see that it's becoming, something more mainstream than it ever was before. I mean, I think if you look at the entertainment industry itself, gaming is now bigger than every other piece of entertainment, like books, movies, streaming services. Gaming itself is bigger than all of those combined. And I mean, that's in large part due to free-to-play and creating these kind of customized interactive experiences for people. That's the reason behind it, right? Like sure, Netflix, everyone's paying the same amount every month, right? Everyone's paying their $10.99, or I think they maybe just raised to $11.99 a month. Whereas, gaming, if you really love a game and that game is being customized for your individual experience, like you're going to be willing to pay a lot more for that customized experience. And I think we're just going to see more and more of that going forward.
And kudos, because I realized that I asked about the platform twice and you swing it beautifully. Thank you for that. Sorry, the day is catching up on me. So from a marketing point of view, if an indie developer wants to work on marketing, they don't have the money that King, Supercell, other companies have, where should they be looking at? Where can they get their chunk of the market?
I think that's what I would jump in. I think there's a lot of people who, a lot of smaller publishers. I mean, obviously a majority of the money is being spent with Google and Facebook, who obviously care that small developers have an ROI, but they don't have tools necessary to monitor that. So I think if you're a small developer, you obviously want to test on Facebook and Google, but look around for places that are looking out for your best interest. We focus on 7-day retention rates, monetization rates, ROAS for our game developers. So your actual spending dollars that you're spending to certain publishers are going towards the things that you care about the most, not just getting somebody to install. And so oftentimes I think it's when you're small, you just think, I'm just going to go spend on Facebook until I run out of money. But I think you really have to look around and find that aligned interest between the publisher who's caring and finding the right audience that you're looking for. And then there are certainly ways to do revenue share deals and profit sharing and those types of things that will make both sides money.
Just one other comment on that. I think one sort of interesting opportunity is back to these new platforms. They will do the marketing for you. So if you can bring your game into a platform like Apple Arcade, they're going to promote your game to drive interest in their platform. The same is true with Hatch. You bring the game to Hatch, and we actually do the marketing and user acquisition on the platform level for you on to your benefit. And now your game is part of a portfolio, so you don't monetize all of that traffic, but you don't spend any money on it. And you benefit from the kind of collective marketing effort that the platform is engaged in. So that's an easy way to get basically free marketing, is to sort of follow behind the wake of these larger platforms that are pushing these initiatives.
It's kind of like being the first influencers on YouTube when YouTube started, because you had less competition and you were there, you were always featured in the beginning, which is not what happens nowadays, right?
Yeah, I mean, if you're going to try to compete in the traditional free-to-play mobile space, fighting for eyeballs is just, I mean, it's an ugly battle unless you're, Scopely, or you've an established brand, an established, pipeline with a war chest to invest in user acquisition. If you're small and you're coming up, you don't have that kind of money. You don't have those resources. So you can either go and try to solicit investment to be able to buy that traffic, or you can think more creatively around how do you tie yourself to other, sort of platforms or other emerging plays where you're a part of that story and benefit from that marketing.
So, how will the community play on the future of indie development? Because we have seen that influencers became quite important for the market, and I imagine that you have the live ops and all the community events, and how important it is to keep community engaged. How do you think this is going to happen in the future? And also, I'm going to pull the lawyer on that as well. Legally, how do you think that also content created by community is going to play a role for the developers in the future? So you have two questions.
You want me to start with that? Okay, I'll start with the boring legal part. So it's complex, because typically when end users are playing a game, they're playing it subject to a license agreement. And typically that license agreement provides that the company that created the game owns all the content, including you as the end user's contributions to the content. So but there are complexities to that, right? Because you have a grant or either an assignment of those rights, or you have a license of those rights back to the company to use it perpetually, irrevocably, et cetera. there become issues though when you're dealing with microtransactions, when you're dealing with cryptocurrency, obviously now becoming very heavily regulated, and when you're dealing with privacy and information sharing on your network between different end users. I don't want to go into the weeds on that because literally everyone will fall asleep. But basically, there are, through license agreements, you can get around a lot of stuff, but you still have to be aware of the underlying regulations. Now to the fun stuff, better stuff.
Yeah, so I think community is becoming a bigger and bigger part of gaming, and every successful game now has some social elements to it. At Scopely, I mean, everything releasing at this point has real-time player versus player competition. We had some of our older games like Yahtzee, Dice with Buddies, have been asynchronous player versus player, but now we're moving to real-time PvP, like our Star Trek game. You've got thousands of users in that game at the same time, hundreds of thousands in the game at the same time, in a massive open universe that you can explore. Everyone's joining guilds or alliances in the game and kind of strategizing real time in that game, chatting in the game, chatting off the game. I mean, the rise of Discord, you can see what an impact that's had on the gaming community at this point. I mean, you can go on Discord any time of day now and chat with your Star Trek Alliance members from around the world and strategize on what you're going to do in the game. And it just creates so much more depth and content to the game than you could ever create on your own or create through kind of bots or entity type competition within a game.
I think we've seen certainly benefits, but you also have some risks in terms of moderating what's being created, and you have the risk of somebody posting something or doing something inflammatory to the other people within the network. And so we've found that sometimes you might, instead of giving a free text communication, you let people communicate through preset phrases or emoticons, and that reduces your risk. And so I think there's a trade-off on both sides. It's certainly worth doing and doing well, but there are some downsides if you just let anybody communicate. We've all probably read comments on various websites. We understand how that rolls.
So to finish, I want to go, what do you think is going to be the biggest challenges for developers in the future? And if you could give a cautionary advice for the developers, what would it be? And then I want everyone. I'm not going to let you off the hook.
I mean, I can start on that one. I guess, being an M&A guy, I think industry consolidation is one of the biggest kind of challenges out there right now. I mean, it's been echoed throughout this panel today, like how tough it is to publish a game, how expensive it is, doing the marketing, user acquisition. If you look at, on the mobile gaming side, like the top 10 games, I mean, the average age of them is close to 10 years old at this point. So it's becoming really hard to kind of break in and break through. So I think that's a big risk to developers, but there's also, if you do something special and you're quick and nimble and can iterate and build really fun gameplay that resonates with users, there's a good chance you're going to get noticed by the big players and have a chance at a big exit.
This really is not my area to speak to. So I think the biggest risk I see in what I do is developers not being properly prepared for success. I think that they oftentimes jump into it, create a game because what they love to do, and they don't have any of the framework in place to eventually be able to exit or to be able to have a viable company. In the future, I personally see a lot of players enjoying games where they're developing their own content within the game. So that's why I thought your question was a very good one. And I think that as players have more opportunities to do that, you'll see even bigger, broader, more incredible networks of games being created.
So I would say the biggest risk is what platform do you pick moving forward? Where are you going to spend your time and money? Because if you pick free-to-play mobile, you're preparing for a certain level of a fight in order to monetize and get eyeballs and traffic, but with a fairly known outcome if you can make that work, versus one of these emerging platforms which is unproven, so maybe less sort of upfront costs, but uncertain ROI. And so how do you make that decision? Which path do you go down? To me, I think that's a difficult question to answer if you're a developer right now. In terms of opportunities, I actually think that these new platforms do provide a lot of opportunity. The tail and the long-term growth is totally unknown, but short-term, these platforms are they're hungry, they're looking for content, they're looking for special relationships. I think Apple's a great example of what they're doing by investing into their studios to create games specific for the arcade. That's a really interesting opportunity if you're a young developer. And to me, I think that's the sort of green field right now.
I think one of the exciting things about gaming and digital entertainment is it's a core part of the economy. It's going to continue to grow. As a developer or a founder, it's figuring out what is that niche, what is the opportunity that you can jump into and where you have a competitive advantage versus all the other folks. And definitely mirror Nick, where when you have big platforms like Facebook, Amazon, Google, and they're saying that they're going to get much more behind it than they have been historically, they're going to be dumping money into the ecosystem. And so, finding out some way to catch their eye and have them fund part of your development or have them market part of what you're doing, but at the same time, somewhat hedging your bets so you're not completely reliant on them. In gaming, it's constantly evolving, it's constantly moving. That's part of what makes it more exciting than working in chemicals or real estate or something. So I think it's keeping a pulse on what those changes are and figuring out based off of your team, based off of your expertise, where you can kind of carve out your space.
Well, I build on that. I think, building games is a very entrepreneurial process, and I think the best entrepreneurial ventures I've seen has a well-rounded group of people. And I think a lot of times you can get people who have the idea for a game and they don't have any real experience or concept around monetization or marketing. And if they build that game without first consulting with some people that have a clue of what they're doing in terms of growth, that's probably not the best place to start. And so I think as a game developer, if I was starting at ground zero, I'd try to find somebody who's done a good job at monetization and marketing and get a lot of feedback from them before I dumped a lot of money in a game that may or may not work. Even if I built it perfectly and it was the most fun game in the world, it still might not be able to compete against everything else. Whereas if you build something, in my experience, that makes money, you generally can fund more of those things. And so if you know how you're going to market it and monetize it from the begin with, that can frame your development structure going into it. And I think the biggest risk would be people not doing anything. I mean, it sounds scary listening to a lot of this stuff up here, but I think games are going to continue to get bigger and bigger and bigger. So I hope everybody starts building more games.
Do you guys have any questions? I know you're tired at this point, but she has a question here at the front.
So I was just wondering, it's probably more of a legal question, but so what sort of, as games are becoming more international and more countries are sort of consuming the same content, what kind of issues do we get into with laws around the countries? Like I know the Netherlands passed one recently on loot boxes. China has a bunch of laws about censorship. So how do we kind of, as future going into games, how do we adapt around that?
How do you handle that from a publishing perspective with localization? I'm just curious about that. Do you have a specific way that Scopely deals with that?
Yeah, I mean, we have a legal team that's kind of keeping up to date on all the regulations, and if we have to take down a SKU in a certain region, we take it down. I mean, historically, we have not been in China at all. I mean, that's something we definitely would like to change, but you can see, I think Tencent announced today or yesterday that they're taking down PUBG in China right now and replacing it with a game, a different game that promotes maybe national identity in China. And so the regulatory environment right now, it's just, it's tough in certain places, and so you've got to kind of try and navigate around it and get the best legal advice you can.
Yeah, and that's the biggest issue is we usually serve as like an outside general counsel to a lot of developers because of the fact that we wind up having to call on people in the UK and Europe and Asia who are very familiar with the local laws and ordinances and regulations, because unfortunately it's impossible to keep up with every single thing that pops up around the world. GDPR in particular has created significant issues for a lot of publishers in Europe. And so, yeah, it's a great question. The answer is, I would say just get your fundamentals in place first as a game developer, just making sure you own your IP so that people aren't worried about that. And you have a corporate form, and then from there, as you expand out, you can look at the different areas you're going to expand into. And also in your agreement with your publisher, to some extent, if it's a work for hire, the publisher is going to wind up being responsible for a lot of that. If you're maintaining ownership of your IP, then you can put in certain reps and warranties that each side is responsible for, kind of keeping an eye on the different legal, the laws within the different areas where you localize the game, different territories.
Any other questions? It's the end of the day. People start getting tired, all right? So thank you very much. Guys, give a big hand. Don't move. Stay there. We're going to finish eating because I was standing up the whole day. Let's finish eating. So we're finishing the day today. I would like, before you go, just to thank once more, Joypack for sponsoring this track. And I wanted to thank Minto Grow, FullPay, App Annie, Lab Cave, and there we go, Vango, Microsoft, those were PlayFab, Facebook, Instant Gaming, Game Analytics, A Thinking Ape, Joypack, Minimob, GenVid, MobPower, Dell DNA, Wapier, and Leia Inc. for sponsoring. And thank you guys again for taking the time to come here and talk to them. I hope you guys had a great day. Don't forget we have the party tonight. You're all gonna be there, right? So it's a great, as you see, I don't wait for the answer because I'm gonna drag them there. If they don't go, Jim knows that. I will drag you there. And you have the opportunity to meet them in one-on-one and have a drink and talk a little bit more. Thank you very much. And if you can please play the video. Thank you guys, thank you.